In 1943, a 14-year-old girl rode her bicycle up to a German officer in the woods outside Haarlem. She smiled, she flirted, she asked if he could help her find her way home. He said yes. She led him deeper into the trees. Then she shot him in the head. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen, and by the time the war ended, she had killed dozens of Nazi officers using the same method: a bicycle, a smile, and a pistol hidden in her bag. The Nazis never suspected her. Why would they? She was a child. She had braids. She looked innocent. That was exactly why the Dutch resistance recruited her. This is the story of how one girl's bicycle became a weapon of war, how trust became a tactical advantage, and how the safest-looking person in occupied Holland became one of its most lethal. Most people think of resistance fighters as men with guns hiding in forests. Freddie Oversteegen was none of those things when she started. She was barely a teenager. She lived with her mother and sister in a working-class neighborhood. She had no military training. She had never fired a weapon. But she had something the resistance desperately needed. She was invisible. By 1943, the Netherlands had been under Nazi occupation for 3 years. The regime had become efficient, brutal, and paranoid. Resistance cells were being crushed. Adult male fighters couldn't move through cities without triggering checkpoints, searches, interrogations. The infrastructure of rebellion was collapsing. That's when Dutch resistance commanders made a decision that would seem insane to any conventional military mind. They began recruiting children, not as messengers, not as lookouts, as assassins. When Freddie was approached by a man named Frans van der Wiel, a commander in the Haarlem resistance, he didn't lie to her about what the work would involve. He told her she would be asked to kill people. He told her it would be dangerous. He told her she might die. She said yes immediately. Her sister Truus, who was 16, joined with her. Their mother approved. This wasn't recklessness. This was strategy. The Oversteegen family had been socialists before the war, anti-fascists by principle, and hunted by the regime since the invasion. For them, resistance wasn't a choice, it was survival. But here's the question that makes this story more than a hard-time curiosity. What does it do to a person to be trained to kill at 14? And what does it say about a war when a child on a bicycle becomes more dangerous than a battalion? Freddie's first missions weren't violent, they were tests. The resistance needed to know if she could lie under pressure, if she could keep secrets, if she could move through Nazi-controlled streets without showing fear. So they started her on courier runs, carrying forged documents, smuggled messages, stolen ration cards, work that would get her arrested if caught, but not executed. She was perfect at it. Nazi soldiers at checkpoints saw exactly what they expected to see: a young Dutch girl on her way to school, or visiting family, or running errands for her mother. They waved her through. Sometimes they smiled at her. She smiled back. Within weeks, the resistance gave her a gun. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no ceremony. Frans van der Wiel handed her a small pistol, showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to hide it in her bicycle basket beneath a cloth. Then he explained the new mission structure. She would be assigned targets: German officers, collaborators, Gestapo informants, people whose removal would disrupt Nazi operations in Haarlem. She would approach them in public spaces, parks, quiet streets, wooded paths, and she would use the one psychological weapon the Nazis couldn't defend against: their own assumptions. A 14-year-old girl asking for help wasn't a threat. She was a damsel, an opportunity, a moment of normalcy in an occupied country where normalcy had become a weapon. The method was simple. Freddie would approach a target, usually alone, and play the part of a lost or frightened child. She would ask for directions or help finding her family or protection from imagined danger. The target, eager to assert authority or indulge paternalistic instincts, would follow her to a secondary location: a forest path, an empty building, a quiet courtyard. Then her backup would appear: other resistance fighters, older, armed, waiting in position. The target would be executed. Freddie would leave first, alone, on her bicycle. By the time the body was discovered, she'd be miles away, indistinguishable from any other Dutch teenager. She worked, over and over. It worked. But here's what the historical record doesn't clarify. How many times did Freddie pull the trigger herself? How many times was she the one who fired the kill shot versus the lure who led the target into an ambush? She never said. Even decades later in interviews, she refused to specify. When asked directly how many Nazis she killed, she would smile faintly and say, "I won't tell you that, but it was more than you'd think." Why the secrecy? What was she protecting? Herself, the memory of her victims, or something darker? To understand why Freddie Oversteegen became so effective, you need to understand the psychology of occupation. The Nazi regime in the Netherlands wasn't just a military force, it was a system of normalized terror. Checkpoints weren't occasional, they were constant. Curfews weren't suggestions, they were enforced with execution. Collaboration wasn't shameful, it was incentivized, rewarded, and in many cases the only way to survive. Within that system, certain people became invisible: the elderly, the very young, women, especially those who performed traditional domestic roles. The Nazis didn't ignore these groups out of compassion. They ignored them because they didn't fit the profile of a threat. Freddie weaponized that blind spot. But she wasn't the only one. The Dutch resistance deliberately recruited young women for operations that required moving through occupied territory undetected. Girls as young as 12 were used as couriers. Teenage women smuggled weapons, explosives, false documents. Some were caught, some were tortured, some were executed in public squares as warnings. Freddie and her sister Truce were different because they weren't just couriers, they were operatives. They participated in sabotage missions, derailing trains, cutting communication lines, planting explosives in German supply depots. They learned to shoot not just pistols, but rifles, submachine guns. They trained in hand-to-hand combat in case a mission went wrong and retreat wasn't an option. And they became exceptionally good at killing without being caught. One mission involved a high-ranking SS officer who had been overseeing the deportation of Jews from Haarlem to transit camps. The resistance wanted him dead, but he was too well guarded for a conventional ambush. He traveled with armed escorts. He varied his routes. He rarely appeared in public without backup. So the resistance sent Freddie. She approached him outside a cafe in day broadlight, pretending to be lost and afraid. She spoke to him in German. Her mother had insisted both daughters learn the language before the war, a decision that now had lethal utility. The officer, flattered and unsuspecting, offered to help. She led him down a side street. Her backup was positioned in a doorway. The kill was efficient. 2 shots,
The
close
Nazis
range,
responded
no
with
witnesses.
fury.
Freddie
They
was
executed
gone
12
before
Dutch
his
civilians
escorts
in
realized he
retaliation,
was missing.
chosen at random from a nearby neighborhood. This was standard protocol. Every German officer killed meant 10 or more Dutch citizens would die as punishment. Freddie knew this would happen. The resistance knew this would happen. They did it anyway. This is where the moral calculus of resistance becomes unbearable. Every assassination Freddie participated in triggered reprisals. Innocent people, people who had nothing to do with the resistance, who may have even opposed it, were rounded up and shot because of actions she helped carry out. Did that make her a hero? A murderer? Both? She wrestled with this question for the rest of her life. In interviews decades later, she would describe the guilt as something that never faded. "You don't forget the faces," she said. "Not the ones you killed, not the ones who died because you killed." But she also never apologized. She never expressed regret for joining the resistance. When asked if she would do it again, knowing the cost, she said yes without hesitation. Why? What makes a 14-year-old capable of that kind of moral clarity? Part of the answer lies in what she had already seen before the war ended. The Oversteegen family had been hiding Jewish refugees in their home since the occupation began. Freddie had watched the Nazis drag neighbors from their houses in the middle of the night. She had seen children separated from their parents at deportation centers. She had heard the stories of what happened in the camps, stories that most people dismissed as propaganda until it was too late to dismiss them. For Freddie, the moral equation wasn't abstract, it was immediate. Nazis were killing her friends, her neighbors, her country. Reprisals were tragic, but they were happening anyway. The only question was whether she would fight back or watch. She chose to fight. And the resistance used her and girls like her with ruthless efficiency. Because the truth is, Freddie wasn't just a fighter, she was a tactical asset. Her age, her gender, her appearance, all of it made her more valuable than older, more experienced operatives. She could go places they couldn't, do things they couldn't, kill people they couldn't get close to. The resistance didn't recruit her in spite of her being a child. They recruited her because of it. That's the part of the story that's hard to romanticize. Freddie Oversteegen was brave, capable, and morally courageous. She was also exploited by adults who put her in situations no child should ever face. Both things can be true. Both things are true. And the Nazis never caught her. Not once. She operated for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945, and was never arrested, never interrogated, never identified as anything other than an ordinary Dutch girl. How? How does a teenage assassin evade one of the most sophisticated security apparatuses in history? The answer is discipline, and something close to dissociation. Freddie described the mental process of killing as a form of compartmentalization. When she approached a target, she wasn't Freddie anymore. She was a character, a role, a performance designed to exploit every cognitive bias the target held. She would rehearse her lines in advance, practice her facial expressions, decide how frightened or helpless or charming she needed to appear. The goal wasn't just to deceive, it was to make the target feel in control as she led them toward their death. This required extraordinary psychological endurance. She had to suppress fear, disgust, hesitation. She had to smile at men she was about to help murder. She had to perform vulnerability while carrying a loaded weapon. And she had to do it repeatedly, knowing that one mistake, one moment of broken character would mean her death. Most people can't sustain that kind of performance for minutes, let alone years. Freddie did it from age 14 to 16. What did that do to her sense of self? In her later interviews, she spoke about the war years as if they belonged to a different person. She said, "I don't recognize that girl. I know it was me, but I can't feel it anymore. It's like watching someone else's life." Psychologists call this trauma dissociation, the mind's way of protecting itself from experiences too overwhelming to integrate. For Freddie, the girl who killed Nazis and the woman who gave interviews 70 years later weren't the same person. They couldn't be. The gap between those identities was unbridgeable. But during the war, that dissociation was what kept her alive. It also made her more effective, because the thing about playing a character is that you can take risks the real you wouldn't take. You can smile at a man you're planning to kill without flinching. You can pull a trigger without hesitation. You can walk away from a body without looking back. Freddie became very good at walking away. One of her most dangerous missions involved sabotaging a German munitions depot outside Haarlem. The plan was simple. Freddie and Truus would pose as local girls offering to sell black market goods to soldiers guarding the depot. While the soldiers were distracted, another operative would plant explosives in the storage facility. The mission almost failed immediately. The soldiers were suspicious. They questioned why two young girls were out after curfew. They searched their bags. They found nothing. Freddie had hidden the contraband in a false bottom of her bicycle basket. But the tension was unbearable. Then Freddie started flirting. She laughed at the soldiers' jokes. She touched one of them on the arm. She made herself seem harmless, even desirable. The soldiers relaxed. They stopped searching. They started negotiating prices. Meanwhile, behind them, the explosives were being set. Freddie and Truus left 10 minutes before the detonation. The blast destroyed the entire depot and killed 4 German soldiers. The Nazis launched a massive investigation, arrested dozens of suspects, tortured several resistance members, but they never connected the explosion to 2 teenage girls on bicycles. Because why would they? This is the part of the story that reveals how deeply the Nazis were trapped by their own ideology. They believed in a hierarchy of threat: men over women, adults over children, soldiers over civilians. That hierarchy made them predictable, exploitable. Freddie understood this instinctively. She didn't need to read Nazi doctrine to know how they thought. She just had to observe how they behaved and then do the opposite of what they expected. But there was a cost to this strategy that went beyond physical danger. Every mission required Freddie to perform femininity as a weapon, to use her youth, her appearance, her perceived helplessness as tools of manipulation. She had to become exactly what the Nazis expected her to be, a harmless, decorative, submissive girl, in order to destroy them. What does that do to your understanding of gender, of power, of your own body? Freddie didn't talk about this much in interviews, but Truus did. Years later, Truus described feeling erased by the work. We weren't people during the war. We were tools, and tools don't have feelings. This wasn't self-pity, it was analysis. The resistance needed Freddie and Truus to be exactly what they were: young, female, underestimated. If they had been boys, or older, or less conventionally feminine, they would have been useless for the missions they were assigned. Their effectiveness depended on their vulnerability, and that vulnerability was weaponized with their consent, but without their full understanding of what it would cost. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about child soldiers, and that's what Freddie was, even if we don't like to call her that. They don't just lose their childhood, they lose the ability to imagine what childhood could have been. Freddie never went to school after 1943. She never had a first boyfriend in the normal sense. She never experienced adolescence as a time of exploration or safety or gradual independence. She went from being a child to being a weapon with no transition in between. And the war didn't end cleanly for her. When the Netherlands was liberated in 1945, Freddie was 17. The resistance disbanded, the missions stopped, the Nazis were gone. And then what? She tried to return to normal life. She got a job. She married. She had children. She never spoke about the war. For decades, almost no one knew what she had done. It wasn't until the 1980s, when Dutch historians began documenting resistance activities, that Freddie's story started to emerge. Even then, she was reluctant to discuss it. She gave a handful of interviews. She appeared in a few documentaries, but she never wrote a memoir. She never sought recognition. When asked why, she said something striking: "I don't want to be celebrated for killing people, even if they were Nazis." This is the moral knot at the center of her story. Freddie Oversteegen was a hero by any conventional measure. She risked her life to fight fascism. She saved countless lives by disrupting Nazi operations. She demonstrated courage that most adults could never summon. But she also killed people, many people, and she did it in ways that required intimate, personal violence, not distant sniping, not abstract sabotage, close.
That's not something you celebrate. It's something you live with. And for Freddie, living with it meant never fully reconciling the girl she was with the woman she became. In her final interview before her death in 2018 at age 92, she was asked if she had any regrets. She paused for a long time. Then she said, "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I did it." That distinction matters. It's the difference between glorifying violence and acknowledging its necessity, between treating war as an adventure and understanding it as a tragedy that requires participation. Freddie never pretended the war made her stronger or better. She was clear that it damaged her in ways that never healed. But she also never wished she had made different choices. Because the alternative wasn't peace. The alternative was complicity. But here's the question that unravels everything we've just constructed. Was Freddie Oversteegen more dangerous to the Nazis than she was valuable to them? Stay with that for a moment. Every time Freddie killed a German officer, the Nazis executed civilians in response. Sometimes 10, sometimes 12, sometimes more. The ratio varied, but the principle didn't. Collective punishment designed to turn the population against the resistance. And it worked. Not universally, but enough. There were Dutch citizens who hated the resistance more than they hated the Nazis, because resistance actions brought reprisals, brought searches, brought executions. From that perspective, every assassination Freddie participated in gave the Nazis justification for tightening control, for escalating violence, for framing the resistance as a threat to Dutch civilians rather than a defense of them. Did the Nazis engineer this dynamic deliberately? Absolutely. Collective punishment was doctrine, not improvisation. But does that absolve the resistance of responsibility for triggering it? Freddie would say yes. Many historians would agree. The moral responsibility for reprisals lies entirely with the occupying force that orders them. But there's a darker interpretation, one that Freddie herself may have considered in her later years, when the moral clarity of wartime had faded into the ambiguity of memory. What if the resistance prolonged the occupation by giving the Nazis an enemy to fight? What if targeted assassinations, while tactically satisfying, were strategically irrelevant compared to larger Allied operations? What if Freddie's missions didn't liberate the Netherlands, they just made the Nazis angrier? This isn't a popular question. It doesn't fit the narrative of brave resistance fighters versus evil occupiers. But it's the question that haunts anyone who studies guerrilla warfare in occupied territory. Because the truth is, the Netherlands wasn't liberated by the Dutch resistance. It was liberated by the Allied invasion. The resistance helped, providing intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure, protecting refugees, but they didn't win the war. They survived it. And the cost of survival was extraordinary. Thousands of resistance members killed, tens of thousands of civilians executed in reprisals, entire communities destroyed because someone in their town had ties to an underground network. Was it worth it? Freddie believed it was,
but she also carried the weight of every reprisal for the rest of her life. She knew the names of some of the civilians killed in response to her actions. She attended memorials for them. She never spoke publicly about whether she felt responsible, but people who knew her said the guilt was constant. So here's the destabilizing reframe. What if Freddie Oversteegen's greatest act of courage wasn't killing Nazis? What if it was living with the knowledge that her courage had consequences she couldn't control? What if the real story isn't about a girl with a bicycle and a gun, but about a woman who spent 70 years processing what it means to be used as a weapon by adults who believed the ends justified any means? Because the resistance did use her. They recruited a child, trained her to kill, put her in situations where capture meant torture and execution. They did this because it was effective, yes, but also because they needed bodies and couldn't afford to be precious about age or innocence. Freddie consented to this, but consent given by a 14-year-old in the middle of an existential war isn't the same as consent given with full understanding of long-term consequences. She didn't regret it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't exploitation. And this is where the story stops being inspiring and starts being tragic. Because we want Freddie to be a hero. We want her story to be simple. Brave girl fights Nazis, wins, lives happily ever after. But that's not what happened. She fought Nazis, she survived, and then she spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. She was a victim and a killer, a child and a soldier, a hero and a weapon. All of those things at the same time, forever. In 2014, Freddie Oversteegen was awarded the Mobilization War Cross by the Dutch government. She accepted it quietly. She didn't give a speech. She didn't celebrate. When asked how it felt to finally be recognized, she said, "It doesn't change anything. The people are still dead." She meant the Nazis, but she also meant the civilians, the ones killed in reprisals, the ones caught in crossfire, the ones who collaborated out of fear and paid for it with their lives when the resistance came for them. All of them, still dead. Freddie died in 2018. Her obituaries called her a war hero, a resistance icon, a symbol of Dutch courage. None of that was wrong, but none of it was complete. Because the real story of Freddie Oversteegen isn't about a bicycle or a gun, or even the Nazis she killed. It's about what happens when a child is forced to become an adult in a single, irreversible decision. When survival requires violence, when innocence isn't lost, but weaponized. It's about living with the knowledge that you did what had to be done, and that what had to be done was unforgivable. And it's about the question Freddie never answered, the one she carried until her death. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't said yes at 14, hadn't picked up the gun, hadn't played the role, would fewer people have died? Or more? She didn't know. Nobody does. But she rode her bicycle into those woods anyway.